Gripping her metal mess kit with trembling hands, Margaret Schultz stared in disbelief at what the American Guard had just placed before her. February 3, 1945, a date that would forever mark her understanding of truth and propaganda. Snow fell outside the wooden barracks of Camp Trinidad in Colorado, and Margaret, a 26-year-old nurse captured with the German auxiliary forces in France, felt her world collapsing around a single, impossible object, 3 strips of crisp bacon resting atop fluffy scrambled eggs. The smell wafted upward, rich and savory, a scent she hadn't experienced in nearly 4 years. "This cannot be prison food," she whispered to Helga Braun beside her. "Perhaps it is some American trick." What Margaret saw defied 7 years of indoctrination under Goebbels's propaganda machine, which had insisted Americans were starving under failed capitalism, barely subsisting on meager rations while the superior German war machine commanded Europe's resources. Yet here, in captivity, was more food, better food, than she had seen since before the war began. As she hesitantly raised the first forkful to her lips, Margaret didn't simply taste bacon. She tasted the first bite of a reality that would shatter everything she had been raised to believe. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent nearly a decade constructing an elaborate mythology about America and its citizens. Since 1938, German state radio and newspapers portrayed Americans as decadent yet deprived, a nation of contradictions where wealth was concentrated among Jewish bankers while ordinary citizens suffered in squalor. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had carefully crafted newsreels showing Depression-era breadlines, Dust Bowl farmers, and urban poverty. These images were juxtaposed against the supposed prosperity and contentment of German citizens under National Socialism. By 1942, when America had fully entered the war, German citizens were regularly told that American soldiers were poorly equipped, malnourished, and fighting for a doomed cause. The women who would eventually become prisoners of war had been raised on stories of American food shortages, where citizens supposedly survived on 1 egg per week and meat once monthly, if they could afford it at all. Official Wehrmacht briefings told of American supply lines stretched thin, with soldiers subsisting on minimal rations while German troops enjoyed the bounty of occupied Europe. This propaganda was particularly effective with German women serving in auxiliary roles, many of whom came from rural backgrounds where Nazi agricultural policies had been portrayed as revolutionary successes. For Margareta Schultz and her compatriots in the Wehrmacht Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, America represented a failed experiment, a nation unable to feed its own people, let alone sustain a war effort across 2 oceans. The contrast between this carefully constructed fiction and the reality awaiting them in American POW camps would prove to be one of the war's most profound psychological weapons. The military situation that led to the capture of German female auxiliaries unfolded primarily in the final 18 months of the European conflict. As Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy beginning in June 1944, hundreds of German women serving in communications, nursing, and administrative roles found themselves caught in the rapidly collapsing Western Front. Unlike their male counterparts who had been captured in significant numbers in North Africa and Italy earlier in the war, these women represented the first substantial group of female German military personnel to fall into American hands. The United States, unprepared for female prisoners, hastily established segregated sections within existing POW facilities. Camp Trinidad in Colorado, Camp Shanks in New York, and Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia became primary housing locations for approximately 873 German women captured between August 1944 and April 1945. The American military, operating under Geneva Convention guidelines, maintained the same nutritional standards for all prisoners, regardless of gender or rank. This meant that German women who had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations as the Reich's resources dwindled suddenly found themselves served the standard American military diet, 3,400 calories daily, including fresh meat, eggs, dairy, and produce, in quantities that had become mythical in wartime Germany. For perspective, by early 1945, the average civilian food ration in Berlin had dropped to 1,200 calories daily, with meat appearing perhaps once weekly, if at all. In the final months of the war, many Germans were surviving on less than 900 calories daily, less than one-third of what POWs received in American camps. This disparity created the perfect conditions for a profound psychological revelation. The journey of discovery began almost immediately upon capture for most of the women. Helga Braun, a 23-year-old radio operator captured near St. Lo in July 1944, recorded her first encounter with American military rations in a diary she maintained throughout her captivity. July 28, 1944. Today I was given a meal by my captors that contained more meat than I have seen in one place since 1941. The American soldiers eat this daily. There was beef stew with actual chunks of meat, not the thin broth with occasional meat fibers we have grown accustomed to. When I asked if this was a special meal for prisoners, the interpreter laughed and said it was Tuesday's standard dinner for everyone. Helga's diary, recovered after the war, documents the progressive realization that unfolded over subsequent weeks. August 10th. The Americans serve coffee with real sugar and milk every morning. They call it regular coffee to distinguish it from the coffee they serve in the afternoon. 2 coffee services daily, with sugar for everyone, not just officers. The sugar bowl remains on the table, unguarded. No one seems to worry about it disappearing. By September, her entries reflected growing disbelief. The Americans threw away half a loaf of bread today, simply discarded it because it was 1 day old. When Greta tried to retrieve it from the garbage bin, they didn't punish her. They apologized and brought fresh bread. They seemed confused by our reaction. Don't they understand that in Hamburg, my mother waits in line for 4 hours to receive a loaf half this size that must last 3 days? For Ilse Wagner, a 31-year-old administrative clerk captured in Paris, the revelation came through a mundane interaction with an American guard. I had been at Camp Shanks for perhaps 3 weeks, she later recounted to American intelligence officers conducting post-war interviews, when I noticed a young guard eating something from a colorful wrapper. He saw me watching and offered me this bar. I didn't understand what it was, but he called it a Hershey bar. It was chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz substance we had been told was chocolate for years. When I asked him how he had obtained such a luxury, he laughed and said he had purchased a box of 24 from the camp canteen for less than $1. 24 chocolate bars. In Berlin, one such item would cost a week's wages on the black market, if available at all. The guard seemed genuinely perplexed by my reaction. For him, this was ordinary, a simple pleasure not worth remarking upon. That's when I began to understand how profoundly we had been deceived about American resources. The women's medical examinations upon arrival created another moment of revelation. Dr. Emma Kruger, a 42-year-old physician who had served with German medical units, found herself being examined rather than examining others. The American doctors expressed concern about my weight and pallor, she wrote in a letter smuggled to her sister in Bavaria. They diagnosed me with moderate malnutrition and prescribed a special diet with additional protein and vitamins. What they described as malnutrition, we had come to accept as normal condition after years of rationing. The female American medical officer seemed genuinely shocked when I told her my weight had been considered stable and acceptable in Germany. "But you're 20 pounds underweight for your height," she told me. "How could your own medical corps not address this?" I had no answer that wouldn't betray the Reich, but inwardly the question resonated. How indeed? If this was the American standard of health, what did that reveal about our own? The shocking abundance extended beyond food. Margaret Schultz was assigned to laundry duty at Camp Trinidad and discovered another aspect of American plenty that defied comprehension. They provided us with soap, real soap, not the gritty, caustic substance we had used in Germany that left hands raw and clothes still somewhat soiled. This American soap produced actual lather and smelled of clean things. More astonishing was the quantity. Each prisoner received 2 personal bars monthly, with laundry soap provided without limit for washing clothes. When I mentioned to the supply sergeant that in Germany, soap had been strictly rationed since 1941, with many families receiving only 1 small bar monthly, regardless of family size, he seemed genuinely surprised. "How did you get anything clean?" he asked. I had no answer because the truth was, we hadn't. Not truly clean, not for years. The psychological impact of these discoveries multiplied as the women shared their experiences. Communal meals became forums for forbidden questions. "If they feed prisoners this way," Gerda Fischer was overheard asking, "what must their own civilians receive?" Such questions would have been dangerous to voice in Germany, but in the strange limbo of captivity, protected by the Geneva Convention and surrounded by evidence of American abundance, these women began a collective reassessment of everything they had been taught. The process wasn't without resistance. Some prisoners, particularly those with strong ideological commitments or family ties to the Nazi Party, initially insisted the abundance was a carefully orchestrated deception, a Potemkin village constructed to demoralize them. Herta Schneider, captured while serving as a secretary to an SS commander, maintained this position for months. "The Americans are staging this display of wealth to break our spirit," she insisted to her fellow prisoners. "They show us this food while our families starve, hoping to turn us against our homeland." Yet even Herta's resistance crumbled in the face of sustained evidence. By January 1945, she too had begun to question the disparities she observed. Lieutenant James Wilson, who served as an administrator at Fort Oglethorpe's women's section, documented this transformation in his monthly reports. "The prisoners arrive suspicious and often hostile, convinced they will be mistreated or starved," he wrote in November 1944. "Within 6 to 8 weeks, their attitude undergoes a remarkable shift as they reconcile their indoctrination with observed reality. Many express disbelief at the standard provisions, particularly fresh fruit daily and meat at least once daily. Several have asked if these rations are being provided at the expense of American civilians, revealing their belief that such abundance requires deprivation elsewhere. When informed that civilian rationing in America is limited to luxury items like coffee, sugar, and gasoline, with meat requiring ration stamps but remaining widely available, they often become quiet and withdrawn, processing the implications. The most dramatic revelations often came through unexpected channels. In December 1944, a group of 27 German women POWs were transported from Camp Trinidad to assist with the seasonal apple harvest at DOS orchards in Washington state. This routine assignment, POWs throughout the country were often used for agricultural labor under the Geneva Convention provisions, became a pivotal experience. Frieda Müller, a former school teacher from Düsseldorf, described the experience in a debriefing interview. "They took us to these orchards that stretched further than I could see, mountains of apples, red, yellow, green, varieties I'd never encountered. When I asked the farmer how much of his crop was requisitioned by the government for the war effort, he looked at me strangely and said, 'None of it. I sell it commercially, same as always.' This seemed impossible. In Germany, everything was requisitioned, every resource commandeered for the war. Here was a man with enough apples to feed a city, selling them on the open market during wartime. What stunned me further was what happened at the day's end. Apples that had fallen to the ground or were slightly bruised, perfectly edible apples, were collected in large bins. I assumed these would be processed for military rations or distributed to poorer communities. Instead, they were loaded onto a truck for animal feed. Apples that would have been treasures in Berlin were being fed to American pigs. I remember sitting in the truck returning to camp, everyone silent, contemplating what we had witnessed. Ursula, who had been the most dedicated National Socialist among us, wept quietly. No words were exchanged. None were needed. We understood in that moment that Germany could not possibly win this war. Not against a nation that could feed its livestock with what would be considered human treasures in our homeland. The revelations continued as weeks turned to months. The women observed not just the quantity, but the systematic nature of American abundance. At Camp Shanks, prisoners witnessed the daily arrival of supply trucks their rhythmic appearance contrasting sharply with the increasingly erratic distributions they had experienced in the final years in Germany. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 0900 hours precisely, the dairy truck arrives, noted former Signal Corps member Ingrid Weber. The reliability is what astounds me. In Munich, we never knew when rations would appear, only that the queues would form whenever rumors spread. Here there is no urgency, no hoarding. The Americans operate with an assumption of continuous supply that seems alien to us after years of scarcity. This observation about logistical capability struck many of the women as more significant than the abundance itself. It suggested not just current plenty, but sustainable plenty, a system designed for perpetual production rather than desperate measures. By early 1945, as Germany's military situation deteriorated rapidly, new arrivals brought stories of increasingly dire conditions in the homeland. These accounts only heightened the contrast experienced by those already in captivity. Lotte Hoffmann, captured in February 1945 during the Allied push into Germany itself, arrived at Fort Oglethorpe having lost 28 pounds in the previous 6 months. "We had been told American prisoners were treated brutally and starved," she later testified. "When I arrived and was served a meal with real butter, not margarine, but butter, and a glass of actual milk, I thought perhaps I had died, and this was some strange afterlife. I had not tasted real butter since 1942. The milk in Germany had been so watered down that it barely warranted the name. Here, within hours of my capture, I was consuming luxuries that high-ranking Nazi officials in Berlin would have envied. How could such things be possible if America was the failing state we had been told it was? The statistical reality behind these experiences was staggering. In 1944, while Germany struggled to maintain basic rationing levels, the United States was producing 260 billion pounds of milk, 4 billion dozen eggs, and 25 billion pounds of meat annually. American agricultural output had actually increased during wartime, with productivity per farmer rising nearly 25% between 1940 and 1945, thanks to mechanization and scientific farming methods. Meanwhile, German agricultural production had fallen by 38% from pre-war levels, with meat production particularly hard hit, declining by over 60% by 1944. These weren't just numbers. They represented fundamental truths about national capacity that no amount of propaganda could ultimately conceal from those experiencing the contrast firsthand. The women witnessed this productive capacity in multiple settings. Those assigned to work details in American factories or farms encountered machinery and efficiency that defied their understanding of industrial capacity. Erika Schmidt, who had worked in a munitions factory in Essen before being drafted into auxiliary service, was assigned to a food processing plant in New Jersey. They allowed prisoners to work alongside American women in this canning facility, she recounted. "My first day I stood watching in shock. The automated production line could process more vegetables in 1 hour than our entire factory in Essen could manage in a day. When I mentioned this to my American supervisor, she shrugged and said this was actually a smaller, older facility by their standards. You should see the new ones they've built in California, she told me. That night I returned to camp and told the others what I'd seen. Lenny, who had been a true believer, accused me of exaggerating. 2 weeks later, she was assigned to the same factory. She returned ashen-faced and didn't speak for 2 days. The evidence mounted in countless small ways. Prisoners noticed that American guards and staff often left food on their plates, an unconscionable act in resource-stripped Germany. They observed mechanics casually discarding machine parts that would have been painstakingly repaired and reused in the Reich. They saw abundance treated as ordinary, waste as unremarkable, and plenty as expected rather than exceptional. Each observation cracked the foundation of their belief in German superiority and efficiency. The contrast between propaganda and reality became impossible to reconcile, leading to profound psychological reckonings. Camp newsletters produced by the prisoners themselves under American supervision began to reflect this changing worldview. The Trinidad Camp Zeitung, established in October 1944, initially featured articles reaffirming German values and inevitable victory. By February 1945, the tone had shifted dramatically. An article titled American Agriculture by former agricultural student Elsa Weber detailed production methods she had observed while working on a Colorado farm. The degree of mechanization must be seen to be believed. A single American farmer with machinery can manage what would require 20 laborers in our homeland. The fuel consumption seems extravagant by our standards, but the productivity justifies the approach. One must ask whether our emphasis on manual labor as virtuous has served us well when such results are possible through different methods. Such perspectives would have been dangerously seditious in Germany, but had become common contemplation among the prisoners. The arrival of newsreels and photographs showing the liberation of concentration camps in April-May 1945 provided the final devastating blow to many prisoners' remaining ideological commitments. Confronted with evidence of atrocities committed in their nation's name, while simultaneously experiencing American humanitarian treatment despite enemy status, created cognitive dissonance too great to resolve through denial. This combination, the revelation of American abundance alongside the revelation of German atrocities, produced a psychological perfect storm. Diary entries from this period reflect profound disorientation. Everything we were taught was false, wrote Helga Braun in April. The Americans, whom we were told were our inferiors in every way, treat their prisoners with dignity and adequate food while German citizens starve. Meanwhile, our leaders, whom we trusted to uphold German honor, have committed unspeakable acts. I no longer know what to believe or whom to trust. Perhaps captivity is a blessing. It has removed the veil from my eyes, however painful the sight. The psychological transformation documented among these women followed recognizable patterns. Initial disbelief and denial typically gave way to anger, not at their American captors, but at the system that had deceived them. This anger often transformed into a quiet, introspective period as they reassessed fundamental beliefs. For many, this process ultimately led to a precarious acceptance of a new reality, one in which the United States represented not a failed system, but a functioning alternative to National Socialism. Dr. Robert Garrison, a psychologist assigned to evaluate prisoner adjustment at Fort Oglethorpe, documented this progression. The women proceed through predictable stages of adaptation, though the speed varies by individual. What differentiates them from male prisoners is the degree to which the material abundance they encounter seems to accelerate ideological reconsideration. Where male prisoners often maintain political convictions despite evidence of American military superiority, the women appear more readily influenced by everyday demonstrations of American productive capacity and standard of living. The simple fact that they receive 3 eggs weekly while their mothers and sisters in Germany might see 1 egg monthly creates a powerful emotional and intellectual challenge to their worldview. Margaret Schultz's transformation exemplified this process. In her initial screening interview upon arrival at Camp Trinidad, she expressed absolute certainty of German victory and condemned American materialism and Jewish influence. By March, her monthly evaluation noted, "Prisoner now expresses curiosity about American manufacturing methods and has requested English language materials on agricultural techniques. Displays decreased hostility and increased interest in comparative economic systems." By August, after Germany's surrender, her file contained this observation: "Subject has applied to serve as translator for new arrivals, specifically to help them adjust to reality more quickly than I did. States she hopes to remain in United States after repatriation process, expressing belief that her nursing skills could be utilized in American hospitals." Many of the women documented their changing perspectives through letters home, though these were heavily censored during wartime. Some found creative ways to communicate their revelations. Ingrid Weber, knowing censors would remove direct comparisons between American abundance and German scarcity, instead wrote seemingly innocent descriptions The camp is situated near mountains where the nature is very different from our homeland. Everything here grows larger, the trees, the animals, even the portions on our plates. I hope someday you can see these natural wonders for yourself." Such coded messages conveyed to attentive readers that something significant had shifted in the writer's perspective. After Germany's surrender, when censorship relaxed somewhat, more direct communications became possible. Many women warned family members to prepare themselves for a different America than they had been led to expect, advice that would prove valuable during occupation. Some prisoners demonstrated their transformed worldview through concrete actions. When Camp Trinidad established a donation program allowing prisoners to contribute from their canteen allowances to war relief efforts, 37 of the 82 women housed there participated, voluntarily supporting humanitarian aid to the nations their country had been fighting. Frida Miller organized a group that requested permission to prepare traditional German baked goods for a local orphanage at Christmas 1944, using their own sugar and butter rations. "We have received such unexpected kindness here," she wrote, in the request to camp authorities. "We wish to demonstrate that German women can show the same humanity." Such gestures reflected not just gratitude, but a fundamental reassessment of allegiances and values. The breaking point for ideological commitment often came through accumulated evidence rather than single incidents. Gertrude Fischer, who had served in the Wehrmacht's administrative corps and maintained strong National Socialist convictions, described her eventual capitulation to reality. "It wasn't any one thing that changed my mind. It was the daily experience of abundance without apparent effort. In Germany, we had been told our sacrifices were necessary and temporary, that rationing and shortages were the price of building a 1,000-year Reich. Here, in captivity, I discovered what real abundance looked like, and it wasn't produced through sacrifice, but through capacity. The Americans weren't working harder than Germans. In many ways, they seemed to work less intensely. They simply had systems of production that functioned on a scale we couldn't comprehend. By February, I stopped believing we could win. By April, I stopped believing we should win. A system that had lied so fundamentally about its enemy, that had convinced us superiority came through struggle, when in fact it came through intelligence and organization. Such a system did not deserve victory. The lasting impact of these prisoners' experiences extended far beyond their individual transformations. Of the 873 German women POWs held in America, 241 eventually applied for permission to remain in the United States after repatriation became mandatory in 1946. While most were returned to Germany under international agreements, 73 eventually immigrated to America between 1949 and 1954, often sponsored by American military personnel they had encountered during captivity. These women brought with them first-hand knowledge that contradicted lingering myths about America in post-war Germany. Margaret Schultz, who returned to Munich in 1946 but immigrated to Chicago in 1952, became an informal community liaison for newly arrived German immigrants, helping them adjust to American abundance without the shock she had experienced. "The hardest thing to explain to new arrivals," she later wrote, "is that the abundance is real and sustainable. Many come expecting to find that American prosperity is somehow artificial or temporary. I tell them about my first breakfast in captivity, how I couldn't believe the bacon was real or that it would be available again the next day. They laugh, but then they experience the same disbelief when they shop in an American supermarket for the first time." Several former POWs played significant roles in post-war reconstruction efforts. Helga Braun, whose diary provided valuable insights into the psychological journey from indoctrination to realization, returned to Germany and eventually worked with the Marshall Plan administration in Frankfurt, helping implement agricultural modernization programs based on techniques she had observed while in captivity. "What I witnessed as a prisoner became the blueprint for what we hoped to achieve in rebuilding," she explained in a 1957 interview. "The America I discovered, not the one I had been taught about, became my model for what Germany could become. Emma Kruger resumed her medical practice in Stuttgart and incorporated nutritional standards she had learned in America, advocating for improved dietary guidelines in post-war German healthcare. These women and others like them formed a bridge between cultures, their personal experiences contradicting lingering propaganda and facilitating genuine understanding. Perhaps most significantly, these former prisoners raised children with a fundamentally different worldview than their own generation had held. The sons and daughters of women like Ilse Wagner and Frieda Müller grew up hearing first-hand accounts that contradicted any resurgent nationalism or anti-American sentiment. My mother made certain I understood the lesson of her captivity, recalled Hans Wagner, born in 1947. She would tell me, question everything you are taught about other nations. I believed terrible falsehoods because I never demanded evidence. This skepticism toward official narratives shaped my entire generation. This intergenerational impact represents the most enduring legacy of the prisoners. Transformation, a lived counter-narrative to propaganda that extended decades beyond the war itself. The story of German women POWs encountering American abundance, particularly through something as fundamental as food, illuminates a profound truth about ideological warfare. Beliefs cultivated through years of careful propaganda collapsed not through counter-propaganda, but through direct experience. No American re-education program could have been as effective as the simple daily reality of bacon and eggs served to prisoners while German civilians subsisted on turnips and bread. The mathematics of national capacity, expressed through something as basic as breakfast, proved more persuasive than any political argument. As Margaret Schultz observed in her final interview before leaving Camp Trinidad, they didn't need to tell us America was stronger. They simply had to feed us. And we understood. In that understanding lay the seeds of Germany's post-war transformation, a nation that would rebuild itself not in the image of the Third Reich's nationalist fantasies, but with a clear-eyed appreciation for the systems and values that produced not just military victory, but genuine prosperity. The breakfast that shocked Margaret in February 1945 didn't just change her understanding of America. It changed her vision of what Germany could and should become.